Do you trust the justice system? What if you were falsely accused and betrayed by those who should protect the law? That's what happened to Jessica Miller, a top LAPD officer, wrongfully convicted of corruption and separated from her loyal K-9, Ranger. But Ranger sensed the truth when no one else did. This is a story of betrayal, corruption, and a hero dog fighting for justice. Will Jessica clear her name before it's too late? Watch till the end, comment where you're watching from, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's begin. The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick with tension. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the solemn faces in the courtroom. Jessica Miller sat rigid in her chair, her hands clenched together on the defense table. She wore her LAPD uniform, though she had been placed on administrative leave since the investigation began. The badge on her chest, once a symbol of honor, now felt like a target. Across the room, the 12 jurors avoided her gaze as they prepared to deliver their verdict. She had spent the past 8 years serving the city, putting criminals behind bars, and building a reputation as one of the most reliable K-9 officers in the department. But today, she was the one on trial. The lead juror, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, stood and cleared her throat. In the case of the state of California versus Officer Jessica Miller, on the charge of evidence tampering and conspiracy to obstruct justice, we find the defendant guilty. The words slammed into Jessica like a freight train. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs from the gallery. In the first row, her boyfriend, Ethan Walker, shot to his feet. "No, this is wrong," he shouted. But the bailiff was already moving toward him, warning him to stay quiet. Jessica remained frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with what she had just heard. Guilty. She had trained herself to stay composed under pressure, to never show fear. But this was different. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she turned to look at her attorney, a well-dressed but visibly shaken man named Daniel Reyes. "We'll appeal," he whispered. But his words carried little conviction. He had been confident, even smug, in the weeks leading up to the trial. The evidence against Jessica was circumstantial at best. At least, that's what he had said. Yet here they were. The judge, an older man with a weathered face and tired eyes, adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Officer Miller, you have been found guilty of all charges. Sentencing will be held in 2 weeks. Until then, you will be remanded into custody." The bailiff approached, handcuffs in hand. That's when Jessica finally reacted. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "Please, let me say goodbye to my partner." Ranger, her K-9 partner, sat in the gallery beside Ethan, his intelligent brown eyes locked onto her. He had sensed something was wrong from the moment they entered the courtroom. The German Shepherd had been trained for high-pressure situations, drug busts, raids, tracking missing persons, but nothing had prepared him for this. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Make it quick." Jessica turned to Ethan, who was gripping Ranger's leash with white knuckles. Their eyes met, and in them, she saw everything she was losing. Her career, her reputation, the life they had built together. Ethan crouched and released the leash. "Go to her, boy," he murmured. Ranger wasted no time, bounding across the room and pressing his body against Jessica's legs. She dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him. The scent of his fur was familiar, comforting, a stark contrast to the chaos unraveling around her. "I'll fix this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise you, buddy. I didn't do this." Ranger let out a low whimper and nuzzled his nose against her shoulder. The bailiff cleared his throat. "Officer Miller, we need to go." Jessica pulled back, pressing her forehead against Ranger's. "Be good, okay? Watch over Ethan." As she stood, she met Ethan's gaze one last time. There were tears in his eyes, but his jaw was set with determination. "I'll find the truth," he said. "I swear it." Jessica nodded, allowing herself to believe him. Then the cold steel of the handcuffs locked around her wrists, and the world as she knew it began to fall apart. The ride to the holding facility was silent except for the occasional static crackle from the radio in the front of the police transport van. Jessica sat in the back, hands cuffed in front of her, staring out the barred window as the city she once protected blurred past. She had spent years patrolling these streets, making arrests, saving lives. Now, she was just another inmate being processed into the system. Her mind replayed the trial in fragments, her own captain testifying against her, the so-called evidence that had miraculously appeared in her locker, and the jury's unwavering expression as they condemned her. But the worst part had been looking into Ranger's eyes, seeing his confusion, his distress, and knowing that he didn't understand why she was leaving. By the time they arrived at the Los Angeles County Detention Center, night had fallen. The massive gray walls loomed ahead, illuminated by harsh floodlights. The van rolled through the gates, stopping just outside intake. As the doors opened, Jessica squared her shoulders. She wasn't going to break. Not yet. 2 guards escorted her inside, leading her through a series of corridors until they reached the processing area. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in an unflattering, sterile glow. One of the guards, a heavy-set man with a buzz cut, removed her cuffs. "Take off your shoes, belt, and any jewelry," he ordered. His voice flat and impersonal. Jessica complied, slipping off her boots and setting them in a plastic bin. She was about to remove her uniform jacket when she heard it, a low, familiar growl. Her heart skipped a beat. Ranger. She turned her head just in time to see Ethan entering the facility with him at his side. The dog's ears were perked forward, his tail low but wagging slightly. The moment he spotted Jessica, he let out a sharp bark and lunged forward, nearly pulling the leash from Ethan's grip. "Easy, buddy," Ethan murmured, tightening his hold. Jessica took an unsteady breath, her eyes locking onto Ethan's. "What are you doing here?" "I pulled every favor I had left to get you 5 minutes," he said. His expression was grim, but there was a fire in his gaze. The judge agreed. "You get to say goodbye." A lump formed in Jessica's throat. She wasn't sure if she wanted to cry or yell at him for putting himself in the middle of this mess. One of the guards crossed his arms. "Make it quick." Ethan unclipped Ranger's leash. The moment he was free, the German shepherd rushed to Jessica, pressing his massive frame against her legs and letting out a soft, whining sound. Jessica dropped to her knees, burying her fingers in his thick fur. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Ranger licked her cheek, his tail wagging furiously. But then something changed. The dog stiffened, his nose twitching. He sniffed along the sleeve of her uniform jacket, then pressed his muzzle against her chest. He let out a low, insistent whine and nudged at her jacket pocket with his snout. Jessica frowned. "What is it?" Ranger's behavior shifted. His ears flattened, his tail lowered, and he started pulling at the fabric with his teeth. Ethan took a step forward. "Jess, check your pocket." Confused, Jessica reached into the inner lining of her jacket. Her fingers brushed against something small and metallic. Frowning, she pulled it out. A tiny, black recording device. Silence fell over the room. Ethan's eyes widened. "What the hell is that?" Jessica turned the device over in her palm. There was only one button. Hesitantly, she pressed play. A burst of static filled the air, followed by voices. "She's too clean. We have to plant it. If we don't, she'll blow the whole case wide open." Jessica's breath hitched. She knew that voice. Captain Richard Carter. "Make sure the locker logs don't trace back to us," Carter continued. "If she goes down, we're in the clear. No loose ends." Jessica's pulse pounded in her ears. Her own captain had set her up. Ethan let out a slow breath. Holy shit. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger officer with sharp blue eyes, stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, reaching for the device. Jessica jerked back. "No," the older guard frowned. "Officer Miller, hand it over." Ethan stepped between them. "You really want to confiscate a piece of evidence that proves she was framed?" His voice was deadly calm, but there was an edge to it. The younger guard hesitated, then looked over at his partner. "We need to take this to the judge." The heavy-set guard's jaw clenched, but he gave a sharp nod. Jessica turned to Ethan, still gripping the device like a lifeline. "How did this get into my jacket?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't know, but Ranger found it. That has to mean something." Jessica exhaled slowly, her mind racing. If Carter was willing to go this far to set me up, then he's hiding something bigger. And I'm not going to stop until I find out what it is. Ethan smirked. That's the Jessica I know. She glanced down at Ranger, who sat beside her, ears alert. Good boy, she murmured. The young guard cleared his throat. We need to take this to the judge right now. Jessica nodded. She wasn't free yet, but for the first time since her arrest, she had hope. And she had Ranger. The recording device sat on the judge's desk, its small black casing almost insignificant compared to the gravity of what it contained. Jessica, still in her LAPD uniform but now with her wrists free of handcuffs, stood in the center of the judge's chambers. Her posture was tense, her fists clenched at her sides. Across from her, Ethan sat on the edge of a chair, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. Judge Naomi Caldwell, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for integrity, held the device in her hand, turning it over as if weighing its importance. You're telling me this was hidden in your uniform? She asked, her voice even. Jessica nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Ranger, my K-9, found it. I don't know how it got there, but that recording, it's real. It's my captain's voice. He's the one who framed me. Caldwell studied her for a long moment, then glanced at the two officers standing by the door. Deputy, play the recording. The younger officer, the same one from the holding facility, nodded and pressed play. The audio crackled, then came the damning words. She's too clean. We have to plant it. If we don't, she'll blow the whole case wide open. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just Carter's voice. There was another. Make sure the locker logs don't trace back to us. If she goes down, we're in the clear. No loose ends. A beat of silence. Then Carter again. And if she starts asking too many questions? If Walker gets involved? Jessica's stomach turned to ice. Then we handle it. One way or another. The room fell into silence. Ethan let out a slow exhale. They were planning to kill us. Judge Caldwell set the device down carefully, her expression unreadable. She folded her hands on the desk, considering her next words. Officer Miller, I need to verify this recording before I can take any official action. But if it's authentic, she exhaled sharply. This is bigger than just you. This is systemic corruption inside the LAPD. Jessica leaned forward. Your Honor, with all due respect, I can't stay in custody while this gets verified. If Carter knows this recording exists, he'll cover his tracks. He'll destroy evidence, silence witnesses. I'm aware, Caldwell interrupted, leveling her with a look. Which is why I'm releasing you on bail, effective immediately. But understand something, Officer Miller. She leaned forward. You are still, as of now, a convicted felon in the eyes of the court. This does not clear your name. Not yet. Jessica nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. Caldwell turned to the deputies. Get this to the DA's office. I want voice authentication done within the next 24 hours. The young officer nodded, carefully picking up the device. Jessica let out a shaky breath as the weight of the past few hours settled over her. She wasn't in the clear, not by a long shot, but at least now, she had a fighting chance. Outside the courthouse, Ethan and Jessica stepped out into the cool Los Angeles night, Ranger trotting faithfully by their side. The courthouse steps were mostly empty, except for a few journalists who hadn't left yet, their cameras clicking as soon as they spotted her. Officer Miller, do you have a statement? One called. Jessica clenched her jaw. The last thing she wanted to do was talk to the press, but she knew they would shape the narrative if she didn't. She turned to face them. The only thing I have to say is that the truth is coming out, she said. And when it does, I hope the people responsible are ready to face justice. Ethan tugged on her arm. Come on, let's get out of here before they start asking the hard questions. As they walked toward his car, Jessica sighed. I can't go home. Carter will have people watching my apartment. Ethan unlocked the passenger door. I figured as much. I booked us a motel outside the city. Just for tonight. Jessica hesitated, then nodded. Good call. They got into the car, Ranger settling into the back seat. Ethan started the engine, but before pulling out, he turned to her. Jess, you okay? She stared out the window for a moment before answering. No, she admitted. But I don't have time to break down. Not yet. Ethan reached over, squeezing her hand. Then let's make sure we bring these bastards down. Jessica looked at him, then at Ranger, who sat watching her with quiet devotion. She took a deep breath. Yeah, let's do it. The neon glow of the motel sign flickered against the windshield as Ethan pulled into a dimly lit parking lot on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The place was old but discreet, far enough from downtown to stay under the radar. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. Ethan killed the engine and turned to her. It's not the Ritz, but at least no one's watching us here. Jessica exhaled slowly. I just need a place to think. As they stepped out, Ranger followed closely, his paws barely making a sound against the cracked pavement. Ethan grabbed the room key from the front desk, and they entered a small, outdated room with faded carpet and the faint smell of cigarette smoke. Jessica sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through her hair. Carter's not working alone. That recording proves he's taking orders from someone else. Ethan leaned against the dresser. We need to figure out who. If we can connect Carter to something bigger, we can blow this whole thing wide open. Jessica nodded. He's careful. He wouldn't leave anything at home or on his work computer. But there's one place we might find something. His personal locker at the precinct. Ethan's brow furrowed. That's risky as hell. I know, Jessica said. But Carter is old school. He doesn't trust digital storage. If he kept records, they're in hard copy. Probably in that locker. Ethan considered this. So we break in? Jessica shook her head. No, we do it smart. I still have a few people at the department who don't believe I'm guilty. If I can get one of them to help, we won't have to force our way in. Ethan nodded, rubbing his jaw. Who can we trust? Jessica hesitated. Detective Sarah Lawson. Ethan raised an eyebrow. She was on your unit, right? She was my partner before I was assigned to K9, Jessica confirmed. She's one of the few people who questioned Carter's case against me. If she can get us access, we won't have to sneak in like criminals. Ethan pulled out his phone. Do you have her number? Jessica gave it to him, and he dialed. The call rang several times before Sarah picked up. Walker? Why the hell are you calling me? Ethan put the call on speaker. Sarah, we don't have time for games. Jessica's innocent, and we have proof. But we need your help. There was a pause on the other end. What kind of proof? Jessica leaned forward. A recording. Carter's voice. We have him admitting that he planted the evidence against me. Sarah sucked in a breath. If that's true, you need to take it to IA. We did, Ethan said. But we need more. We need something solid before Carter realizes what's happening. Silence. Jessica could almost hear Sarah's thoughts racing. Finally, she spoke. What do you need me to do? Back at the precinct, the LAPD station looked the same as always, bright, sterile, filled with the quiet hum of officers going about their work. But for Jessica, stepping back inside felt like walking into enemy territory. She pulled the baseball cap lower over her eyes and kept her head down as she and Ethan followed Sarah through the side entrance. Sarah walked briskly, barely glancing at them. I have 10 minutes before someone starts asking questions. Carter's on a call with the DA, so we don't have long. Jessica nodded. Let's move. They walked through the maze of desks, heading toward the back, where the lockers were. Sarah stopped at the security panel and swiped her ID. The door beeped, and she pushed it open. Inside, rows of metal lockers lined the walls. Jessica spotted Carter's immediately, third from the left, the number 118 stamped into the door. Sarah pulled a small key from her pocket. I might have borrowed this from evidence lockup, she admitted, passing it to Jessica. Jessica didn't waste time. She slid the key into the lock, turned it, and pulled the door open. Inside, there were neatly stacked folders, a few loose papers, and a locked cash box. Ethan grabbed the files, flipping through them. These are case reports. Some of them have your name on them. He paused, frowning. Wait, these don't match the official case files from your trial. These are fabricated, Jessica finished. Sarah cursed under her breath. He planted evidence in more than just your case. Jessica turned her attention to the cash box. We need to open this. Ethan pulled out a pocket knife and wedged it into the latch, prying it open. The lock snapped, and the lid popped up. Inside, they found something unexpected. A bundle of photos. Jessica picked them up, flipping through them quickly. The images showed Carter with a group of men in an upscale restaurant. She recognized two of them immediately, high-ranking LAPD officials. But the third man made her blood run cold. Ethan swore. That's William Harrington. Sarah's eyes widened. Assistant Director of the FBI? Jessica's pulse pounded. Harrington was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. If he was involved, this went higher than they ever imagined. Ethan pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. This is it. This is what we need. Jessica nodded, gripping the photos tightly. Now we just have to live long enough to use it. Sarah exhaled, glancing at the door. Then we better get the hell out of here before someone notices we're in Carter's locker. Jessica closed the locker, wiped down the lock, and slipped out with Ethan and Sarah. But as they stepped into the hallway, they ran straight into Captain Carter. His eyes narrowed, scanning their faces. Then, slowly, his lips curled into a knowing smirk. Going somewhere, Miller? Jessica's stomach twisted into knots as she locked eyes with Captain Richard Carter. The fluorescent lights above cast deep shadows over his face, making his smirk seem even more sinister. He was a seasoned cop, a man who had built a career on intimidation and control, and now he stood in front of them, exuding the kind of confidence that came from knowing he held all the power. Beside her, Ethan tensed, his grip tightening on his phone. The device that now contained photographic proof of Carter's ties to high-ranking officials in a corruption ring. Sarah Lawson, standing just slightly behind them, subtly shifted her stance, positioning herself as if ready to intervene. Carter tilted his head. You know, Miller, it's funny running into you here. Last I checked, convicted felons don't have clearance to wander around LAPD property. Jessica forced herself to stay calm. And last I checked, captains don't plant evidence to put innocent officers behind bars. Carter chuckled, shaking his head. You should be more careful about making accusations like that. They could get you into trouble. Ethan took a step forward. We're past accusations, Carter. We have proof. Carter's smile faltered slightly. It was subtle, but Jessica caught it. The tiny shift in his expression, the brief flicker of concern in his eyes. He knew they had something. Jessica pressed forward. It's over. You set me up, but you got sloppy. And now we have enough to take you down. Carter's face darkened. You really think this ends with me? You think you know who you're dealing with? He took a step closer, lowering his voice. You don't have a damn clue how deep this goes. Jessica didn't flinch. Then maybe you should enlighten me. Carter exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You always were a good cop, Miller. But good cops don't last long when they start asking the wrong questions. The warning was clear. Sarah suddenly cleared her throat, stepping forward. Captain, unless you have a reason to detain us, I think we're free to go. Carter's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking between the three of them. For a long moment, Jessica thought he might make a move. Call in officers, have them arrested on the spot, fabricate a reason to charge them with something. But then he smiled again. Go ahead, he said, stepping aside. Enjoy your little investigation while you can. Jessica didn't trust it. She exchanged a quick glance with Ethan and Sarah before walking past Carter, keeping her pace steady. Ranger, sensing the tension, stayed close to her side. His ears perked forward in alertness. As soon as they exited the precinct, Ethan muttered, "That was too easy." Jessica nodded, unlocking the car. Yeah. Which means he's already making his next move. Decoding the evidence back at the motel, Jessica spread out the documents and photos they had taken from Carter's locker. Ethan sat on the bed, flipping through the images while Sarah paced near the window, occasionally peering through the blinds. Ranger lay near Jessica's feet, his eyes never leaving the door. Jessica tapped a finger on one of the photos. Carter sitting at a dimly lit restaurant with two LAPD officials and William Harrington. This is what connects him to the FBI. Ethan nodded. And if Harrington is involved, it means this isn't just a dirty cop running side deals. This is federal. Sarah exhaled. That explains why Carter was so cocky. He's not scared of IA or the LAPD because he's got protection from above. Jessica picked up one of the case files. These aren't just fabrications for my case. Some of these names, she pointed to a list of officers. These are people who were investigated, fired, or went missing over the past 10 years. Ethan leaned in. You think they were all framed like you? Maybe not all, Jessica said. But some of them were probably taken out because they got too close to the truth. Sarah crossed her arms. So what's our next move? Jessica hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud made it all the more real. We need to go after Harrington. Sarah let out a breath. That's a hell of a leap. Ethan agreed. You're talking about taking down one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. If we don't do this right, we won't just get arrested. We'll disappear. Jessica looked at them both. I know, but if we don't stop this, how many more innocent people are going to end up like me? Or worse? Ethan rubbed his temples. All right, but we can't just walk into the FBI office and ask for an interview with Harrington. We need something that forces his hand. Jessica's mind raced. Then, she spotted something in one of the files, a handwritten note. It was an address, and underneath it, a time, 2 a.m. Jessica frowned. This was in Carter's files. This could be a meeting spot. Ethan checked his watch. It's almost midnight. If we move now, we might be able to catch them in the act. Sarah sighed. I can't believe I'm saying this, but let's do it. Jessica looked down at Ranger. You ready for another job, boy? The German shepherd let out a short, eager bark. Jessica smiled grimly. Let's move. The streets of Los Angeles were quieter at this hour, the usual chaos replaced by an eerie stillness. Jessica gripped the wheel of the unmarked sedan Ethan had borrowed from a friend, her knuckles white against the leather. The address from Carter's files led them to an industrial district near the port of Los Angeles, a place where backdoor deals and dirty business thrived under the cover of darkness. Ethan sat beside her, double-checking the photos they had taken. In the back seat, Sarah monitored the police scanner on her phone while Ranger sat at attention, ears perked. We're close, Sarah muttered, lowering the brightness on her screen to avoid drawing attention. Jessica slowed the car, pulling into a narrow alley beside an abandoned warehouse. The building was old, its brick walls covered in faded graffiti, a single streetlight casting long shadows over the entrance. A few cars were parked out front, all black SUVs with tinted windows. Looks like we're not the only ones interested in this place, Ethan muttered. Jessica nodded. We need to be careful. If Carter or Harrington is here, they won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens their operation. Sarah checked the clip of her service weapon. Then let's not give them the chance. Jessica glanced at Ranger. Stay close, boy. The German shepherd let out a soft whine, his muscles tense with anticipation. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows as they approached the building. The metal door on the side was slightly ajar, and inside, muffled voices carried through the cavernous space. Jessica held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. From their position, they could see a group of men gathered near a table littered with documents and duffel bags. Carter was there, his expression serious as he spoke in hushed tones to another man. A tall figure with salt and pepper hair, dressed in an expensive suit. Jessica's heart pounded. William Harrington. Holy shit, Ethan whispered. That's him. Jessica pulled out her phone and started recording. Harrington's voice was low but firm. We're too exposed. Miller's still alive, and now she's digging. I don't care how you do it, Carter. Handle it. I want her gone before morning. Carter stiffened. Sir, she's got people on her side. We need to be careful. Harrington cut him off. I don't pay you to be careful. I pay you to make problems disappear. Jessica clenched her jaw. They had him. This was the proof they needed. But then, Ranger let out a soft growl. Carter's head snapped up. Someone's here. Jessica cursed under her breath. We need to move now. But it was too late. Go. Sarah hissed as gunfire erupted. The warehouse filled with the deafening sound of bullets ricocheting off metal beams. Jessica ducked behind a stack of wooden crates, dragging Ethan down with her as Sarah fired back, covering their escape. Ranger barked, his stance defensive as he positioned himself in front of Jessica. "We need to get out of here," Ethan shouted over the chaos. Jessica glanced toward the exit. Too far. More men were flooding into the warehouse, blocking their escape route. Carter's voice rang out. "Find them. I want them dead." Jessica's mind raced. If they stayed, they were done. If they ran blindly, they'd be cut down before making it out. Then she spotted an old maintenance hatch near the far wall. "There!" she shouted. Sarah and Ethan followed as Jessica sprinted toward the hatch, Ranger at her heels. Sarah kicked it open, revealing a narrow tunnel leading under the warehouse. One by one, they crawled inside just as bullets ripped through the wall behind them. Jessica was the last one through. As she pulled the hatch closed, she locked eyes with Carter one last time. His face twisted in fury. "You can't run forever, Miller." Jessica smirked. "Watch me." Then she slammed the hatch shut and disappeared into the darkness. The underground tunnel smelled of damp earth and rusted metal, the air thick with dust as Jessica, Ethan, Sarah, and Ranger moved quickly through the darkness. The space was narrow, forcing them to crouch as they navigated through the old maintenance passage that likely hadn't been used in decades. Ethan wiped a streak of sweat from his forehead. "Tell me there's an exit somewhere that isn't back in that death trap." Sarah pulled out her phone, using its flashlight to scan the tunnel ahead. These old industrial buildings used to have emergency exits leading toward the port. If we keep moving, we should find a way out. Jessica's mind was already racing ahead. The recording she had on her phone, the one that captured William Harrington ordering her death, was their golden ticket. But it wouldn't mean anything if they didn't get out of here alive. Ranger suddenly stiffened. His ears perked as he let out a deep, warning growl. Jessica instinctively reached for her gun. "We're not alone." A distant metallic clank echoed through the tunnel. Then another. Sarah gritted her teeth. "They're coming after us." Jessica didn't hesitate. "Move." They pushed forward, their steps quick but careful as the sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. The tunnel curved ahead, and Sarah spotted a rusted metal grate covering what looked like an old storm drain leading to the docks. She pointed. "That's our way out." Ethan ran ahead, gripping the bars. "It's locked." Jessica turned to Sarah. "Cover me." Sarah positioned herself, gun raised, as Jessica and Ethan braced against the bars. Together, they pushed, gritting their teeth as the metal groaned in protest. Ranger let out an anxious whimper, his instincts sensing the urgency. Footsteps echoed closer. Jessica heard Carter's voice behind them. "They're in here. Don't let them get away." With one final heave, the grate gave way, crashing onto the concrete outside. "Go, go, go!" Ethan shouted. They scrambled through the opening, emerging into the open air near the shipping docks. The distant sound of waves crashing against the pier was a sharp contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Ranger was the last one through, his paws barely touching the ground before Sarah yanked the grate back into place, sealing off the tunnel. They ran toward the nearest row of cargo containers, using them as cover. The cool night air filled Jessica's lungs, but she knew they weren't safe yet. Ethan checked his phone. "We need to send this recording to someone before they shut us down." Sarah nodded. "The LAPD is compromised. IA won't move fast enough. We need to go straight to the Department of Justice." Jessica hesitated, glancing at the city skyline in the distance. "We need someone who can make this public. Someone untouchable." Ethan's eyes flickered with understanding. "A journalist." Jessica met his gaze. "You know someone?" He nodded. "Maria Torres, investigative reporter for the LA Times. She's exposed law enforcement corruption before. If we give this to her, she'll make sure it gets out before anyone can cover it up." Sarah frowned. "And how do we know we can trust her?" Ethan smirked. "Because she hates the FBI almost as much as we do right now." Jessica exhaled sharply. "Then let's move." Delivering the evidence, they drove across the city in Ethan's car, keeping their route unpredictable. Jessica's nerves were on edge. She checked the mirrors constantly, expecting Carter's men to tail them at any moment. Ranger sat alert in the back seat, his ears constantly twitching. After 20 minutes, they pulled up outside a modest two-story apartment in West Hollywood. The lights were still on inside. Ethan turned to Jessica. Wait here with Ranger. Sarah and I will go in first. Jessica didn't like being left out, but she trusted Ethan. She gave a short nod. Be quick. Ethan and Sarah stepped out and walked up to the door. Ethan knocked twice, a pause, then 3 times more, a signal. The door opened slightly, revealing a Latina woman in her late 30s with dark eyes filled with suspicion. Maria Torres. She looked at Ethan. You better have something good. Ethan held up his phone. I have something that'll blow the LAPD and the FBI wide open. Maria studied him for a beat before stepping aside. Get in. Inside, Maria listened intently as Ethan and Sarah laid everything out. The evidence against Carter, the recording implicating Harrington, and the network of corruption spanning from local law enforcement to federal agencies. When Ethan played the recording, Maria's expression shifted from skepticism to grim determination. She leaned back in her chair. If I publish this, you know what happens next, right? Jessica, who had entered with Ranger halfway through the conversation, met her eyes. They'll come for all of us. Maria nodded. But if I don't, this continues. More innocent people framed. More lives destroyed. She tapped her fingers against the table, thinking. Then, she stood. I need an hour to verify the audio and corroborate what I can. I have sources who can confirm Harrington's movements tonight. Once I do that, I'll publish. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. An hour's a long time. Maria glanced at him. Then you better find somewhere safe to hide. Jessica's phone buzzed. A blocked number. Her stomach tightened as she answered. A familiar voice filled her ear. You think a newspaper story will save you, Miller? Jessica's blood ran cold. It was William Harrington. You just signed your death warrant. The line went dead. Jessica lowered the phone, looking at the others. We're out of time. Maria's jaw tightened. Then I better type fast. Jessica turned to Ethan and Sarah. We need to disappear for a while. Sarah nodded. I know just the place. Jessica looked down at Ranger, giving him a reassuring scratch behind the ears. Stay close, buddy. It's about to get worse before it gets better. And with that, they prepared for the final battle. The motel was miles away from downtown Los Angeles, hidden in the foothills where the city lights barely reached. Jessica sat on the edge of the bed, her gun resting on the nightstand beside her, her mind replaying Harrington's words over and over. You just signed your death warrant. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Ranger lay on the floor, his ears twitching at every sound outside. Ethan and Sarah sat across the room, both on edge. Maria Torres had already published the article. The entire city was waking up to the corruption scandal that stretched from the LAPD to the FBI, and Harrington was officially exposed. But that didn't mean he was going down without a fight. Jessica exhaled. We need to end this before he finds us. Sarah nodded. Carter's one thing, but Harrington? He has resources we can't even imagine. If he decides to disappear, we may never get another shot. Ethan was already working on his laptop, scanning through recent law enforcement reports. Harrington's not going to sit around and wait to be arrested. He'll run. Jessica frowned. Where? Ethan's fingers flew across the keys. If I were him, I'd be looking for the fastest way out of the country. I just hacked into an FAA database. There's an unscheduled private jet taking off from a secure airfield in Nevada in less than 2 hours. No flight plan filed, no commercial record. Jessica's eyes narrowed. That's him. Sarah stood. Then we have 2 hours to stop him. Ethan shut his laptop. We need a plan. The chase to the airfield, they didn't waste a second. Within minutes, they were speeding down the highway in a stolen SUV, borrowed from one of Sarah's trusted contacts inside the LAPD who had secretly sided with them. Ranger sat alert in the back seat, sensing the tension. The airfield was over 200 miles away, and every mile counted. Jessica checked her gun. If we don't get to him before takeoff, he's gone. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly. He's too powerful to be arrested like a common criminal. The second he lands, he'll have people waiting to protect him. Ethan loaded a fresh clip into his pistol. Then we stopped the plane. Jessica nodded. Whatever it takes. The SUV roared through the desert, the city lights fading behind them. Every second ticked away like a countdown to disaster. And then, in the distance, they saw it. A small, private airfield, and a jet with its engines warming up. Jessica's pulse spiked. That's him. Sarah hit the gas, and the SUV sped onto the tarmac. The final standoff the airfield was mostly empty, except for a few guards standing near the jet. But as soon as they saw the approaching vehicle, they reached for their weapons. Jessica flung the door open before the SUV even came to a stop. "Cover me." Sarah and Ethan fired off warning shots as Jessica sprinted across the tarmac, Ranger right beside her. The jet stairs were down, and standing at the top was William Harrington. He smirked. "Miller, you really don't know when to quit." Jessica raised her gun. "Step down, Harrington. It's over." Harrington laughed. "No, Officer Miller. It's over for you." Behind him, Carter appeared from the shadows, gun drawn. Jessica barely had time to react before he fired. A single shot rang out, but Ranger moved first. The German shepherd lunged, clamping his powerful jaws around Carter's arm. The shot went wide, missing Jessica by inches. Carter screamed as Ranger dragged him to the ground, growling viciously. Jessica rushed forward, kicking Carter's gun away and slamming him into the tarmac. He groaned, dazed from the impact. Meanwhile, Harrington turned to run back inside the jet. Ethan fired a shot at the landing gear. The bullet struck, sending sparks flying. Sarah took aim. "Don't move, Harrington." The jet was crippled. There was nowhere left to run. Jessica walked toward him, her gun steady. "It's over." Harrington smirked. "You think you won?" Jessica narrowed her eyes. "No, but I made damn sure you lost." Sirens blared in the distance as FBI agents, real, clean ones, stormed onto the tarmac. Maria Torres had done her job. The Justice Department had issued an immediate warrant for Harrington's arrest. Within seconds, the agents had him in cuffs. Jessica watched as they dragged him toward a convoy of black SUVs, her chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment sank in. It was finally over. She turned to Ranger, kneeling beside him. The dog panted, his tail wagging despite the chaos. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You did good, buddy." Ranger licked her hand. Ethan walked up, draping an arm around her shoulders. "So, what now?" Jessica exhaled. "Now, I clear my name. And then?" She looked at Ranger. "We go home." The morning sun was just beginning to rise over Los Angeles when Jessica, Ethan, and Sarah returned to the city. The previous night had been a blur, gunfire, adrenaline, and the long drive back with the knowledge that the man who had tried to destroy Jessica's life was finally in federal custody. Harrington had been taken into a secure holding facility, but the fight wasn't over yet. Jessica still had to clear her name. As the SUV pulled up outside the LAPD headquarters, Jessica let out a slow breath. It felt strange being back here, walking into the building she had once called home, knowing how close she had come to losing everything. Ranger trotted beside her, his posture alert. He could sense the tension in the air. Inside, officers turned to look as Jessica walked through the precinct doors. Some looked shocked, others wary. Word had spread fast about Harrington's arrest, but Jessica wasn't naive. There were still people here loyal to Carter. She spotted Captain Richard Carter, sitting in his office, staring at his phone. He hadn't been arrested yet, but that was about to change. Jessica squared her shoulders. Time to end this. Facing Carter, she didn't knock. She pushed the door open, stepping inside with Ethan and Sarah flanking her. Carter barely glanced up. "You've got some nerve walking in here." Jessica smirked. "Considering the circumstances, I'd say you should be the one worried." Carter sighed, setting his phone down. "Do you really think this changes anything, Miller? Harrington may be done, but people like me? We always survive." Jessica leaned forward, her hands on his desk. "Not this time." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a USB drive, placing it in front of him. Carter's smirk faltered. "What's this?" Jessica's voice was calm. "Everything. The money trails, the cover-ups, the officers you framed before me. It's all in there. And in case you're thinking about destroying it, I've already sent copies to IA, the DOJ, and every major news outlet in the country." Carter's face darkened. Ethan crossed his arms. "You're done, Carter." The office door opened, and internal affairs officers stepped inside. One of them, a woman Jessica recognized as Lieutenant Karen Michaels, looked at Carter. "Captain Richard Carter, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of evidence tampering." For the first time, real fear flickered in Carter's eyes. Jessica stepped back as the officers moved in, snapping cuffs around his wrists. He turned to her, his jaw tight. "You think you're a hero, Miller?" Jessica met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "No, I just did what you were supposed to do." Carter was led out of the office, and the entire precinct watched as their captain was taken into custody. Jessica let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was over. Restoring her name a week later, Jessica stood before a panel of LAPD officials in a hearing room. It was a formal review, one that would decide whether or not she would be reinstated. The police commissioner adjusted his glasses. "Officer Miller, given the circumstances of your case, the department owes you an apology. Your wrongful conviction has been expunged from the record, and all charges against you have been dropped." Jessica nodded, her hands folded in her lap. The commissioner continued, "That being said, the question before this panel is whether you wish to return to active duty." Jessica hesitated. She had spent years as a cop. It was all she had ever known. But after everything she had been through, the betrayal, the fight to prove her innocence, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back. She looked down at Ranger, who sat at her feet. His tail thumped against the floor as if waiting for her decision. Finally, she exhaled. "I think I need some time away." The commissioner nodded. "You've earned it." Moving forward that evening, Jessica stood on a quiet beach, the waves rolling gently onto the shore. Ethan was beside her, his hands in his pockets. Ranger ran ahead, his paws kicking up sand as he chased the wind. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had been carrying finally begin to lift. Ethan nudged her. "So, what now?" Jessica smiled slightly. "I don't know. Maybe something different." He chuckled. "You? A civilian?" She laughed. "I know. Sounds weird, right?" Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Whatever you do, you won't be doing it alone." Jessica leaned into him, watching Ranger play in the surf. For the first time in a long time, she felt free, and that was enough. The Los Angeles Superior Court was packed. Reporters, federal agents, and members of the LAPD filled the rows, all waiting for the trial's conclusion. The tension was palpable, the weight of months of corruption finally coming to a head. Jessica sat beside Ethan and Sarah in the gallery, her fingers laced together tightly. Ranger lay at her feet, his head resting against her boot, as if sensing that this was the final battle. At the front of the courtroom, William Harrington stood at the defense table, his expression cold and unreadable. Even now, with mountains of evidence against him, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had spent decades bending the system to his will. Jessica's eyes flickered to Captain Richard Carter, seated a few feet away, now dressed in a prison jumpsuit. He wasn't testifying today. His deal with the prosecution meant he had already given up everything they needed. But the way he sat, his gaze never leaving Jessica, made it clear that he hated her. Too bad. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. After a few formalities, the jury foreman stood. The judge's voice was steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a man in his 60s, nodded. "We have, Your Honor." Jessica held her breath. The foreman cleared his throat. "On the charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, bribery, and attempted murder, we find the defendant, William Harrington, guilty on all counts." A murmur rippled through the courtroom before the judge banged his gavel. Harrington's face remained neutral, but Jessica saw it. The flicker of disbelief, the first crack in his impenetrable arrogance. The judge turned to him. "William Harrington, you have betrayed the public trust and used your power to destroy lives. You will be remanded into federal custody until your sentencing." Jessica exhaled slowly. It was over. For real this time. Harrington was led away, and Carter was escorted back to his holding cell. Jessica didn't need to hear his sentencing. He was going away for a long time. She turned to Ethan, who squeezed her hand. "You did it." She shook her head. "We did it." Sarah leaned in. "And for the record, I'm never doing anything like this again. Jessica smirked. You say that now. Sarah groaned. No, seriously. Next time someone gets framed for something, I'm just sending a fruit basket and staying out of it. Ethan laughed, but Jessica's gaze drifted to Ranger, still lying at her feet. She reached down, scratching behind his ears. You're the real hero here, buddy. Ranger's tail thumped against the floor, as if he already knew. Clearing her name, the days that followed were a blur of press conferences, legal proceedings, and internal investigations. The LAPD underwent a massive purge. Corrupt officers were fired, and Jessica's wrongful conviction was wiped from the record. A ceremony was held at LAPD headquarters, where the police commissioner publicly acknowledged the department's failure and offered Jessica her badge back. She hesitated, staring at the silver shield in his outstretched hand. Ethan, standing in the back of the room, watched her carefully. He already knew what she was thinking before she said it out loud. Sir, Jessica said slowly, I appreciate this, but I don't think I can come back. A murmur spread through the room. The commissioner nodded. I understand. Jessica took a deep breath. I became a cop because I wanted to make a difference. But I've learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from inside the system. Sometimes you have to fight for it another way. She turned and walked away, her LAPD career officially behind her. A new beginning. A month later, Jessica, Ethan, and Ranger stood on a beach, watching the sun set over the Pacific. Ethan skipped a stone across the waves. So, no more badge. No more LAPD. What now? Jessica smirked. We start over. He raised an eyebrow. Define we. Jessica exhaled. You and me. And Ranger. Maybe I use what I learned in a different way. Private investigations. Something that lets me actually help people instead of dealing with department politics. Ethan chuckled. A detective agency? Why not? Sarah's voice interrupted them. Please tell me you're not asking me to be your receptionist. Jessica grinned. I was thinking more along the lines of partner. Sarah sighed dramatically. God help me. Jessica laughed. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. She crouched beside Ranger, scratching his chest. Ready for the next adventure, boy? Ranger barked in response. Jessica smiled. No matter what came next, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running anymore. She was chasing the future. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched until here, comment, I watched until here, and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.